Her sons died bleeding from the inside, not from wounds, but from her blood. Princess Irene of Hesse passed hemophilia to her children and watched two of them die slowly, silently, while she lived. She wasn't exiled. She wasn't executed. She stayed and carried the weight of a royal curse alone. No crown, no glory, just the guilt of being born. This is the tragedy no history book wanted to remember. She was born into the glow of candlelit palaces and the cold permanence of imperial portraits, where every step on marble floors echoed with the certainty of inheritance and the invisible weight of something darker. Irene Louise Marie Anne of Hesse and by Rhine, born on July 11, 1866, did not arrive in the world with fanfare meant for queens. Yet the blood coursing through her veins linked her to the throne of the most powerful woman in the Western world. Queen Victoria. Her father, Grand Duke Louis IV of Hesse, ruled over a principality often overlooked by empires, yet anchored firmly within the web of European nobility. Her mother, Princess Alice of the United Kingdom, was Queen Victoria's second daughter, thoughtful, charitable, dutiful, and in the eyes of her children, a kind but distant figure molded by grief and responsibility. To the world, little Irene was a princess born into impeccable pedigree. But no royal cradle, no velvet blanket, no embroidered christening gown could cover what slept quietly in her genome. A mutation. Hemophilia. A single flawed gene lurking silently like a drop of ink in a chalice of wine. Colorless at first, tasteless even, but slowly staining everything it touched. It passed from Queen Victoria to her daughter Alice, and from Alice into the future, into Irene. It was not visible in childhood, not detectable through any infant smile or girlish laugh, and no physician of the 19th century had yet the means to detect a genetic ghost hiding in the blood of the unknowing. To the court, she was healthy, quiet, a shy girl with calm blue eyes and a well-disciplined walk, easily lost in the shadow of louder siblings and the more politically connected. But beneath all that tool and training, a future catastrophe slept in her cells. One she wouldn't discover until it was far too late. And in that sense, Irene was not merely born into royalty. She was born into inevitability. In a time when monarchies still treated marriage as chess and bloodlines as currency, the idea of marrying for love was a delicate illusion few could afford. Irene, like her cousins and sisters, understood this from youth. Love might be a gift, but alliance was law. And for those descending from Queen Victoria, alliances were often forged by turning inward, toward their own family tree. Irene's family was a latticework of shared chromosomes. Her cousins were also her potential suitors. Her siblings, born of consanguineous unions themselves, knew that proximity to the British crown could be both a blessing and a sentence. In this royal labyrinth of intermarriage, beauty and intelligence meant little compared to heritage and political viability. And still, at first, there was no sign of danger. Irene reached adolescence with no visible ailments. She excelled in etiquette, in music, in the kind of feminine restraint expected of princesses not destined for thrones. She wrote letters in graceful penmanship, expressed loyalty to her parents, traveled with her siblings, and spent long summers at Darmstadt or Osborne House. Homes steeped in quiet discipline and the silent ache of Victorian mourning, since her mother had never fully recovered from the deaths of Irene's younger siblings to diphtheria. But it would not be death that haunted Irene's early years. It would be the illusion of safety. For hemophilia is not a disease that screams at birth. It whispers decades later, when it's passed on to someone else. The mutation that lived in Irene's body would never bruise her skin, never make her bleed uncontrollably, never force a surgeon to operate. She was a carrier, not a sufferer, a silent vessel of royal affliction. And unlike tuberculosis or syphilis or consumption, diseases that ravaged bodies before the world's eyes, this one made its entrance gently, cruelly, in the bodies of boys, of sons, of heirs. But Irene did not yet know that. Not as she turned 16, then 18, then 20. Each year another thread in the quiet tapestry of a life stitched by propriety. Not as she was courted, photographed, presented. And certainly not in 1888, when she accepted the hand of her cousin, Prince Heinrich of Prussia, the dashing younger brother of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and a man whose naval uniform and loyalty to the German Empire made him a prime marital prize. The decision, though sanctioned and celebrated, was not without consequence. It was not just a union of royal houses. It was the folding of a bloodline back onto itself. Because Heinrich, too, was a grandchild of Queen Victoria. And so, without knowing it, two invisible rivers of flawed DNA came rushing toward each other under the guise of ceremony, sealed by vows, consecrated in cathedrals, and toasted with champagne by Europe's elite, none of whom could see what was truly being written, a prophecy in blood. But at the time, the photographs lied. The couple looked radiant, she in white satin, he in epaulettes and medals, their smiles small but sincere, their future assumed to be bright, and for a moment, brief, suspended, and doomed. Everything seemed perfect. They moved to Kiel, near the Baltic coast. Heinrich pursued his naval career. Irene adjusted to her new household. She gave birth to a first son, Waldemar, in 1889, then a second, Sigismund, in 1896, and finally, Heinrich Jr. in 1900. And still, there was no sign of disaster, no reason to worry, no public mention of illness or defect. Their children, at least to the casual observer, were healthy. But royalty does not always bleed in front of crowds. Sometimes it waits. It waits for a fall. It waits for the smallest cut. And when it begins, it does not stop. Irene, who had grown up watching her mother mourn quietly, would soon become a mirror of that same grief. But unlike Alice, who had died young, Irene would live long enough to see her tragedy stretch across decades, to see the cost of that single mutation echo down into her sons, to the very marrow of their bones. She had not asked for it. She had not known she carried it. But she would never stop paying for it. And in that silence, in that haunting realization that love, marriage, and motherhood had all unknowingly served as carriers of doom, Princess Irene of Hesse began her slow, quiet descent, not from political power or scandal, but from innocence, from the illusion that noble blood could ever be safe. In the eyes of European courts, the marriage of Princess Irene of Hesse and by Rhine to Prince Heinrich of Prussia was not only appropriate, it was ideal. It solidified blood ties between powerful dynasties, reinforced the intricate web of alliances that held monarchies upright, and adhered to the quiet but unbreakable logic that ruled royal unions, that the crown should never drift too far from itself. And so, on May 24th, 1888, amid organ music, horse-drawn carriages, and applause that echoed off cathedral stones, Irene wed her first cousin. The union was celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy and decorum. Queen Victoria, though aging and weary from loss, approved the match. Kaiser Wilhelm II, already a looming figure in the German Empire, sanctioned it with brotherly pride. And the public, still draped in the twilight of the 19th century's illusions, saw nothing wrong in two grandchildren of the same monarch vowing to share a bed, a life, and a lineage. But biology cares nothing for etiquette. Behind the embroidered curtains and the carefully lit photographs, a cruel arithmetic was beginning to take shape. One that no palace tutor could explain, no bishop could sanctify, and no doctor of the age could prevent. Because the truth was that Irene and Heinrich did not simply share affection or loyalty. They shared ancestry, a tightly coiled genetic thread knotted at the center of Europe's most prestigious bloodline. Queen Victoria, for all her grandeur and wisdom, was unknowingly a carrier of a silent affliction. And by encouraging marriages within her own descendants, she had planted the seed of tragedy into every cradle that followed. By the time of Irene's wedding, that seed had not yet bloomed into full catastrophe, but it was already growing, quietly and without mercy. Their wedding photographs, if viewed now with the cold clarity of hindsight, reveal something almost ghostly. A poised young woman with tightly drawn lips, her eyes fixed not on her new husband, but somewhere else entirely, as if already aware that something within her had been set in motion. And Heinrich, though vibrant in his naval uniform, could never have imagined that beneath his wife's gentle manner lay the same lethal inheritance that had already begun to ripple across the continent. The marriage, by all visible standards, was affectionate. Heinrich adored his wife. He wrote to her tenderly during long absences at sea. She, in return, stood by him with steadfast devotion, never challenging his position or role. Unlike many royal consorts, theirs lacked visible conflict or ambition. But perhaps that is what made it even more tragic. There was love, or at least something close to it. There was trust. And within that trust, unknowingly, they conceived a legacy of pain. Their first son, Waldemar, was born in 1889. Healthy, vigorous, a source of pride. And no one, no physician, no nursemaid, no grandmother, suspected what slumbered in his blood. But genetics, unlike kingdoms, cannot be ruled. And while Waldemar grew, and while Irene basked in the quiet fulfillment of motherhood, the truth remained curled within her lineage like a snake beneath polished floorboards, waiting. In 1896, she bore a second son, Sigismund, who showed no signs of illness, no unexplained bruises, no cuts that refused to heal. He thrived, and the family breathed easier, perhaps assuming that whatever rumors haunted Victoria's line had spared them. But fate rarely delivers warnings. It prefers silence. The third child, born in 1900, was named Heinrich, like his father, a charming, bright-eyed boy who smiled early and ran before most. And still, there were no signs. For the first few years, he played with his brothers, rode ponies, laughed in gardens, posed for family portraits in sailor suits, all under the illusion of safety. But hemophilia does not strike with ceremony. It waits for an accident, a fall, a cut, a bruise that won't go away. And when it comes, it doesn't ask if you are royal. Irene, who had once watched her mother mourn in silence as two of her siblings succumbed to diphtheria, now stood at the precipice of her own reckoning. She had seen it before, though she may not have understood it fully. She had read the letters, heard the whispers, and noticed the subtle avoidance whenever Queen Victoria's male descendants were discussed in medical terms. Yet none of it had prepared her for the moment she saw her youngest child, once bouncing through halls, now pale, cold, and breathless in her arms, because a small bump to the head had triggered internal bleeding that would not stop. It wasn't war that claimed him. It wasn't famine or poison or plague. It was her. her womb, her blood, her inheritance. The walls of her world didn't collapse with thunder. They simply narrowed. And from that day forward, the wide halls of her marriage grew quieter, colder. Her dresses, once adorned for galas, began to gather dust. Her face, once composed for portraits, learned a new expression, the mask of guilt. And Heinrich, her husband, her cousin, her partner in silence, did not blame her. Not openly. Not ever. But what could be said between two people bound by love, by family, and now by death? He continued his naval service. She continued the motions of court life. But something irreparable had broken. Not in their marriage, not in their faith, but in the dream that their blood could ever be anything but a curse. And though their surviving sons would grow into men, carry titles, serve in militaries, and smile for photographers, Irene would never again look at them without also seeing the shadow of the child who died choking on his own blood before his life had even begun. The marriage remained intact. The public saw no scandal, no divorce, no drama. Just another royal couple fulfilling their roles in an age of empire. But inside the woman who once danced through the gardens of Darmstadt, something had died that day, and not even time would bring it back. Because a marriage built on shared history may last a lifetime. But a marriage haunted by shared blood cannot remain untouched. There are few things in the world more fragile than a child's skull, and even fewer things more cruel than the illusion that everything will be fine until it isn't. In 1904, in a royal nursery somewhere behind manicured hedges and linen-curtained windows, a small boy fell. Not from a tower, not into water, just from his feet. An innocent tumble, the kind every child takes. The kind that bruises a knee or brings tears and nothing more. But this child was not like others, and the wound, though unseen, would not close. Heinrich of Prussia, Irene's youngest son, was 4 years old. His hair was soft and pale like candlelight. His laugh, once echoing through polished corridors and echoing stairwells, had made even the stiffest courtiers soften. He loved toy boats and animals, and mimicking his father's salute with comical precision. To everyone around him, he was the symbol of innocence preserved in aristocratic gold. A boy born into privilege, shielded by power, and untouched by the dirt of the outside world. But when he fell that day, some said it was a bump against a table. Others whispered it was a misstep on the stairs. His body began a silent rebellion. No blood pooled on the surface. No gash opened on his head. But something began bleeding deep inside, hidden from sight but not from consequence. At first, no one panicked. Children fall. They cry. They recover. Nurses applied cold cloths and told him to rest. His mother kissed his forehead and whispered comforting words in German, her voice laced with a nervous steadiness only a mother understands. But as the hours passed, Heinrich's skin began to pale, and his breathing changed. His lips, once pink and chattering about toys and bedtime stories, turned the color of lavender silk left too long in shadow. His limbs grew cold. His eyes flickered between confusion and terror. And Irene knew. Not because the doctors told her, though they came and they probed, and they whispered diagnoses that only confirmed what she already understood, but because she had seen the same pattern unfold before. Not in her own children, but in the stories of her relatives, in the medical notes scribbled about her young cousins, in the silent dread that had haunted her line since the days of Queen Victoria's grandchildren. The bleeding would not stop because it could not, and there was nothing. Nothing in all of imperial Germany, in all of the resources of monarchy or modern science, that could reverse it. By sunset, he was no longer speaking. By moonrise, he was barely conscious. And by morning, he was gone. 4 years old. Gone. Not to fever, not to war, not to divine judgment, but to something written silently inside him before he ever took his first breath. In the hours after his death, the palace fell into a strange, muted hush. No royal bulletins were issued. No flags were lowered. The world outside did not pause. A prince had died, but not one who would rule. Not one who had time to become valuable in the ledger of history. But Irene didn't need a crown or a title to measure her loss. She sat alone in a room that still smelled of her child's skin and the lavender oils used in his bath. His toys remained in place. His shoes were by the wall. A blanket, half folded, still held the shape of his sleep. And in that moment, more than any state affair or dynastic concern, she became something history rarely records in detail. A grieving mother. Not a royal, not a figurehead, not a genealogical link in Europe's great political machinery. Just a woman who had outlived her child, and worse, who had given him the very thing that killed him. The doctors had no comfort to offer. They spoke in the cold tones of science, explaining mechanisms and clotting factors, as if the explanation could untangle the guilt. But Irene didn't need their confirmation. She knew it. She had read it. She had feared it from the moment she saw blood in places it didn't belong. Hemophilia, passed from mother to son like an accusation written in DNA. And now, that legacy, silent in her own body, had roared to life in the most brutal, unforgiving way. After the funeral, which was private, discreet, with only the closest of family in attendance, Irene changed. Not suddenly, not like a collapse, but like a door that slowly, imperceptibly closes. She stopped attending public events. She declined invitations to court balls and charity functions. She sat out of portraits, and when she was photographed, her expression was distant, unsmiling, wrapped in a thin veil of polite detachment that even the best artists could not disguise. It wasn't depression in the modern sense. It was something quieter, more numbing, a slow retreat from the visible world, from anything that reminded her of hope. She still mothered her 2 surviving sons, Waldemar and Sigismund. But even they felt it. The way she touched them more cautiously, the way she watched them play with a silent prayer behind her eyes, the way she flinched ever so slightly when they ran too fast or climbed too high. And in those small moments, she began to live not in the present, but in a constant state of anticipation of tragedy. Because when one son dies bleeding on the inside, the others become question marks, time bombs. And love, once simple and unconditional, becomes something tortured. She never spoke publicly of Heinrich's death. No interviews, no memoirs, no long letters to sympathetic queens. Her grief remained hidden behind lace curtains and hushed conversations. Even within the family, the topic became taboo, because to speak of it was to confront what none of them wanted to admit, that the empire's blood was poisoned, that the very thing which gave them their titles and lands, their lineage, was also a death sentence handed to the innocent. And Irene, who had once been praised for her obedience, her discretion, her elegance, now became something more tragic than any scandalized duchess or deposed queen. She became a woman who killed without ever lifting a hand, not with poison, not with betrayal, but with love, with motherhood, with blood. Waldemar was supposed to be the strong one, the firstborn, the quiet anchor of his mother's fading hope, and the proof that perhaps not every thread in the family's tapestry would unravel in blood. Born in 1889, before the shadow of hemophilia had fully taken its place at the family table, Waldemar grew into a tall, gentle man with the kind of disciplined composure expected of Prussian nobility, but with an unusual softness in his gaze, as if he had always known, from childhood, that he would have to walk more carefully than other boys. He had inherited the same faulty legacy passed down from Queen Victoria's body to Irene's womb. And yet, unlike his younger brother, who had died gasping for breath after a simple fall, Waldemar lived. He lived because he was cautious, because he learned early to fear stairs and avoid sharp corners, because his mother and doctors hovered in anxious silence over every bruise, every scratch, every bloody nose that might mean too much had already been lost. He learned, like all hemophiliacs of his era, to live not fully, but carefully, to calculate each movement, each gesture, each heartbeat, knowing that joy and death might sit closer together than most people could ever comprehend. And for a while, it worked. He survived childhood. He reached adolescence. He joined the military in ceremonial roles, bearing uniforms not for battle but for symbolism, because everyone around him understood that blood would kill him faster than any bullet. His life unfolded like a dance choreographed to avoid pain. And within that fragility, he carried himself with a kind of muted dignity, never shouting, never demanding, never rebelling against the fate handed to him by genetics and sealed by empire. But the world around him was not built for fragility. In 1945, as the war that had consumed the world for the second time in a generation reached its final, terrifying crescendo, Waldemar and his mother found themselves in retreat, fleeing not from armies in the traditional sense, but from collapse itself. Germany was burning. Cities were reduced to ash and cinder. Trains were full of mothers holding children whose fathers had already vanished. Roads swelled with carts, horses, refugees, and the defeated. And somewhere in that avalanche of fleeing bloodlines and broken uniforms, a prince, no longer relevant, no longer protected, was bleeding from the inside again. Waldemar had been injured. Not visibly, not dramatically, no bombs, no bullets, but something internal had torn. Perhaps it was stress, perhaps it was a jolt from a vehicle, or perhaps it was simply time. No one could say. But the pain began like a whisper in the gut and slowly grew sharper, darker, until he knew something was wrong. They reached the town of Tutzing in southern Germany. The war was ending. The Reich was disintegrating. The roads were full of ghosts. Waldemar needed blood transfusions, urgently. His condition, hemophilia, was no longer a mystery. By 1945, doctors understood its mechanics. They knew what could be done. They knew he didn't have to die, if the right care arrived quickly. But nothing about that moment in history was built for mercy. The area had fallen under Soviet control, and the medical stations had their own priorities. Soldiers, civilians, the wounded of the Red Army. Blood supplies, limited and controlled, were allocated only to those deemed part of the living machinery of the Soviet war effort. Waldemar, a German prince, a relic of a broken monarchy, was not one of them. They refused to treat him. Whether it was political, logistical, or simply bureaucratic cruelty, the result was the same. No blood, no help, no exceptions. And so Irene, then nearly 80 years old, sat beside her son's bed and watched again, as death arrived, not with drama, but in silence. There was no gunfire, no explosions, just the slow seep of life leaking through the veins of a man whose only crime was to be born with the wrong pattern in his chromosomes. Waldemar's death took hours. His breath became ragged. His eyes dulled. His body, still noble, still formal, in posture even in agony, curled inward as the internal bleeding spread. And Irene, who had outlived empires, revolutions, and the collapse of everything she had been born to represent, realized she was now also outliving her children. For the second time, she witnessed what hemophilia truly was. Not a condition, not a diagnosis, but a slow execution carried out by history itself. She had carried the gene. He had carried the burden. And now she carried the silence. There was no funeral procession, no military salute, no royal mourning dress. The Germany of 1945 had no room for ceremony. The Reich had collapsed. The monarchy was a memory, and a mother burying her son was just another forgotten act in a country where loss had become the national language. Waldemar's body was laid to rest with as much dignity as the situation allowed. A simple grave, a quiet moment, a name that meant little to the new order. And Irene, now a shadow of a princess, returned to Hemmelmark with one less reason to speak. She didn't cry in public. She didn't scream at God. She simply folded further inward, like paper burned at the edges. Because grief, when repeated often enough, stops looking like grief. It begins to look like habit. And Irene had long ago stopped believing that her presence in this world was anything more than an accident of survival. Her 2 sons were gone. Both hemophiliacs, both dead. One in childhood, one in the twilight of war, and in both cases, the cause was the same. Not hatred, not violence, not fate, but her blood, her love, her legacy. And though Sigismund, her second-born, still lived, healthy, distant, and carrying the unbearable burden of being the only one left, Irene would never again fully inhabit the role of mother. She had become something else, not a victim, not a villain, not a martyr, but a quiet witness to her own undoing. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest role of all. Sigismund of Prussia, the middle child, the one spared by the silent curse that had killed his brothers, lived not with the privilege of survival, but with the quiet, unshakable burden of witnessing what survival meant when it came wrapped in his mother's grief and his family's shame. When every dinner table, every framed photograph, and every heavy silence reminded him that he had inherited life not by merit, but by omission. He had not been marked, not by the gene that stole childhood from Heinrich and adulthood from Waldemar, not by the internal bleeding or the slow collapse of organs that turned each of their final days into a hushed agony. Yet he had been marked in other ways, carved invisibly by the spaces left behind, by the emptiness in his mother's eyes, by the stillness that followed every memory too painful to speak aloud. Unlike Waldemar, who carried his hemophilia like a glass chalice balanced on trembling hands, or Heinrich, who died before memory could even settle into his bones, Sigismund grew up under the long shadow of dread that cloaked their home. An atmosphere so muted, so tightly wound with unspoken fear, that even joy had to tiptoe in, afraid of breaking something delicate that could not be repaired if cracked. He watched his mother shrink, not in height, but in presence. Each year pulling back further from public life, each season shedding more of what had once made her a princess, not just in title, but in appearance. Her posture less regal, her smile less rehearsed. her voice quieter in rooms where it used to fill the air with measured calm. And perhaps what made it worse was that she never explained. She didn't speak of Heinrich's death. Not in the way mothers in lesser households might, with tears and stories and open mourning, but instead kept his memory locked behind a door she would not open, even for herself. Sigismund knew the outlines of the tragedy, but he never received its full shape. He was a boy when it happened, still too young to understand what bleeding in the brain meant, but old enough to sense that something in his mother had broken and would never again be put right. And then, years later, when Waldemar died in 1945, Sigismund, now a grown man, a father himself, stood beside his mother in yet another unmarked graveyard and realized that she had not simply lost a second son. She had lost the last part of herself that still believed in the future. He remembered her standing there in silence, not weeping, not speaking, not looking at the sky or the cross or even the casket, but simply staring into the soil as though she were waiting for the ground to speak back to her. In the years that followed, he tried to bring her out of it. He invited her to family gatherings, offered to escort her to events, wrote her letters from abroad, gentle ones, filled with updates and photographs of her grandchildren, hoping that perhaps new life might balance the weight of the dead. But Irene declined almost everything. She responded with short, polite notes, never unkind, but always distant, like someone replying not from another place, but from another century. She no longer posed for portraits, though her family insisted. She no longer entertained visitors, except for those who brought silence with them. She no longer moved through rooms with the grace of royalty, but rather with the caution of someone walking through a museum of her own losses. And Sigismund, who had been raised to be respectful, dutiful, and loyal, did not press her. He simply watched. Watched as the woman who had once kissed his forehead goodnight and placed a hand on his shoulder during piano lessons became a shadow in lace. Always seated, always composed, always staring just past the person speaking to her, as though she were searching for someone who used to be there, but wasn't anymore. In many ways, Irene had survived too much. Too many funerals, too many bloodstains, too many decades where the only sound in the room was her own breathing and the soft rustle of curtains that never opened. Her home at Himmelmark became a mausoleum not of relics, but of memory. A place where everything was preserved not for its beauty or historical value, but because change had become unbearable. The furniture remained as it had been during her children's youth. The books were untouched. The rooms were quiet not because no one visited, but because she no longer allowed joy to raise its voice. And Sigismund, in time, stopped trying to bring her back. He loved her. He never stopped. But he realized that the woman who had once smiled for wedding photographs and sung lullabies had been slowly erased by a grief so deep it didn't even cry out. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't angry. She didn't curse the heavens or blame her ancestors or raise her voice in political protest. She simply endured. She became a creature of repetition. Tea at the same hour, books reread again and again, letters written in perfect penmanship but with no warmth. She avoided questions. She avoided mirrors. She avoided anything that might reflect who she had once been before the curse in her blood found form in her sons. And Sigismund, though spared from that fate, bore its echo. He lived a long life. He traveled, married, served, and represented the vestiges of his family with grace. But he never forgot that survival, in this family, came at the cost of watching everyone else disappear. He never forgot what it felt like to come home and see his mother seated in the drawing room, not moving, not reading, just staring, always staring, at an empty chair across from her. And in that chair, he imagined, she saw Heinrich as he was at 4 years old. He saw Waldemar as he was at 25. And maybe, sometimes, she saw herself. Not as the princess the world once admired, but as the woman who had given birth to sons who could not bleed without dying. If grief were a private inheritance, a solitary affliction confined to one mother and her dead sons, perhaps Irene might have found some comfort in believing her tragedy was unique. Cruel, yes, but hers alone, not shared, not echoed, not magnified through generations of royal suffering. But the truth was far worse, because Irene's loss was not the bitter misfortune of one household. It was the manifestation of a genetic fire that had already begun to consume entire branches of Europe's crowned families. A fire lit not by sin or mistake, but by the silent passage of a single mutated gene passed from mother to child, from queen to princess, from womb to coffin. Her sister Alexandra, bright, religious, and fragile beneath her imperial posture, had married into even greater consequence, taking her vows as the consort of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. A union celebrated with fanfare, with opulence befitting the autocracy of Romanov splendor, yet one that would, in time, become not a crown, but a crucifix, as the same flawed blood that had stolen Irene's child would soon curse the future of an empire. When Tsarevich Alexei, the long-awaited heir to the Russian throne, was born in 1904, the Romanovs rejoiced as if centuries of insecurity had suddenly been erased, as if the weight of a crumbling dynasty could be suspended simply by the arrival of a boy. But the celebration was short-lived, because by his first bruises, his first internal bleed, it became heartbreakingly clear that Alexei, too, had inherited hemophilia. And with that revelation, a throne began to shake. Irene knew. She knew before the official statements, before the rumors began twisting through palaces and embassies. She knew from the silence in her sister's letters, from the sudden shift in tone, from the guarded optimism that had soured into veiled panic. Alexandra had carried the gene, just as Irene had. And now another child, another boy, another innocent, had become the unwilling host to a legacy neither mother had asked for, but both had passed on. But in Russia, the stakes were not merely personal. They were political, spiritual, apocalyptic. Because in the hands of a fragile boy bled the future of a continent's last great autocracy, and every secret hemorrhage, every long night of fever and whispered prayers, became another crack in the imperial facade, inviting charlatans, mystics, and opportunists into the sacred heart of power. Enter Rasputin. He came not with armies or policies, but with strange eyes and stranger promises, offering healing through divine touch and unholy manipulation, weaving himself like a parasite into the veins of a desperate mother and a crumbling monarchy. His influence over Alexandra, born not from seduction or ideology, but from her paralyzing fear of losing her son, eroded the Romanovs from within, breeding scandal, distrust, and superstition at the very center of a regime already on the brink of revolution. Irene, watching from afar, saw her sister become vilified, ridiculed, transformed from empress to fanatic in the eyes of a people who no longer trusted their sovereigns. And behind it all, beneath the layers of politics, faith, betrayal, and madness, was the same mutation, the same blood, the same inherited cruelty that had killed her son, now feeding the downfall of a dynasty. By 1917, the empire fell. By 1918, Alexandra was dead, shot in a basement beside her husband and 5 children, including Alexei, who died not on a throne, not in a palace, but on a blood-stained floor. His hemophilic body executed before it could bleed out on its own. Irene never spoke publicly of it. She never published reflections, never granted interviews, never allowed history to record her weeping or condemning or even explaining. But those who knew her said the Romanov massacre hollowed her further, deepened the silence already blooming inside her since Heinrich's death, added another invisible coffin to the collection she carried in her memory. And it did not end there. Her sister Marie, Duchess of Edinburgh and Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, died in a shipwreck in 1920, swallowed by the same sea that had once brought her to royal marriages and state visits, leaving behind another void in Irene's increasingly empty family tree. Her niece, Princess Alice of Battenberg, mother of Prince Philip and later mother-in-law to Queen Elizabeth II, was diagnosed with schizophrenia, institutionalized, separated from her children, and subjected to treatments that blurred the line between therapy and punishment. Her mental health unraveling in the echo chamber of royal expectations and unspoken trauma. And through it all, Queen Victoria's name remained untarnished in the public memory. Still revered as the grandmother of Europe, still admired for her longevity and empire, even as the blood she carried had laced her descendants with decay. Irene, who had never ruled, never rebelled, never written a memoir to explain herself, lived through all of it. She read the death notices. She received the telegrams. She folded the letters and placed them in drawers she never opened again. Because everywhere she looked, every cousin, every niece, every godchild, there was evidence that the curse had not stopped with her sons. It had spread. Like a quiet contagion passed at the dinner table. Like a whisper that turned into a storm. Like blood that bled and bled but refused to be seen until it was too late. It was not just her tragedy. It was not just her shame. It was an entire generation marked by the decision of one queen to marry her children for power, to fold her lineage inward, to build an empire of alliances without understanding that she was stacking the bricks with a defect that no amount of wealth, ceremony, or protocol could ever contain. And Irene, though never called empress or queen, became in many ways the archivist of that unraveling. A woman who lived long enough to see not just her family, but the very fabric of Europe's royal legacy bleed out from within. She had not fired a weapon. She had not signed a law. She had not started a war. But through blood alone, she had helped end an age. History, for all its noise and drama, for all its coronations and assassinations and revolutions carved into marble and bronze, has little use for quiet endurance, for lives lived without scandal, without conquest, without flame. And so Princess Irene of Hesse and by Rhine, who did not rule, who did not rebel, who simply lived and watched and outlived, slipped so easily from its pages that one could be forgiven for thinking she had never been there at all. She did not disappear in a single moment. Not with exile, not with trial, not with public disgrace, but faded gradually, gently, like a figure stepping backward into shadow, each year dimming a little more until she was no longer seen, no longer asked for, no longer quoted or summoned or photographed. In the roaring decades of the 20th century, when monarchies fell and democracies fractured and dictators shouted through loudspeakers while bombs rewrote borders, there was no place left for women like her. Women who had once been photographed in stiff gowns beside crowned relatives, who had written letters in 3 languages and spoken in a 4th, who had danced with generals before watching their sons bleed from within. She remained in Germany through 2 world wars, but her name did not make headlines. Her face did not appear in broadcasts, and her opinions, if she still held any, were never published or sought. She was neither heroine nor traitor, neither collaborator nor resistance figure, simply a survivor. One of many aristocrats who chose silence over spectacle, retreat over confrontation. During the Nazi era, she said nothing. No speeches, no endorsements, no denunciations. Whether she agreed, feared, or simply refused to engage, no one can say with certainty, because she left no diary, no interviews, no trail of public statements that historians might dissect for meaning. And perhaps that was intentional, a deliberate choice to vanish slowly in a world that had punished her family not for crimes, but for what they carried inside them. Her home at Hemmelmark became her final stage, an estate on the Baltic coast where the sea whispered against the rocks and the wind carried no politics, only the echoes of things lost. She rarely left it, rarely opened its doors, rarely raised her voice beyond the bounds of necessity. And so the years began to stack atop one another, like untouched linens in an old armoire, orderly, silent, yellowing with time. Inside that house, memory lived without conversation. The portraits remained on the walls, though she no longer paused to look at them. The letters stayed bundled in drawers, though the handwriting had long since faded. The children's rooms, those of Heinrich, now gone so many years, and Waldemar, whose ghost lingered longer, were neither shrine nor museum, just untouched spaces, preserved not to display grief but to avoid disturbing it. No visitors remarked on them, because there were few visitors left. Royalty, stripped of its function and now inconvenient to regimes built on war and ideology, had become a private language, spoken only in glances and gestures and the careful way one sat at dinner. And Irene, though descended from emperors and married to the brother of a Kaiser, no longer wore her titles with meaning. They were relics, like the porcelain in the cabinet, beautiful but breakable, valued only by those who remembered what they used to mean. In those final decades, she became a creature of habit, a woman who woke at the same hour each morning, took her tea at the same window each afternoon, and walked the same gravel paths around the same silent gardens. Paths where no children laughed, no horses trotted, no music played. Her world shrank, not from poverty or illness, but from absence. Her siblings had died. Her husband was gone. Her sons, 2 in the grave and 1 forever haunted, no longer visited with frequency. The newspapers stacked by her door came unopened. The invitations, when they still arrived, remained unanswered, not because she was bitter, but because she no longer knew how to enter rooms that didn't echo with the weight of what she'd lost. And so, like fog slipping between trees, she receded, until even those who remembered her name weren't quite sure if she still lived. But she did. And that, perhaps, is the strange miracle of her story. Not that she suffered, for many have, and not that she was forgotten, for most are, but that she endured long after her usefulness to empires had expired, long after her sons had died from a disease she could not control, long after her sister had been shot in a basement and buried in secret. She endured not with fire, but with quiet, not with memoirs, but with memory, not with protest, but with presence. And in doing so, she became something rare in royal history. Not a cautionary tale, not a scandalous figure, not a martyr, but a monument to what it means to live with guilt too large to confess and a past too heavy to carry forward. She didn't ask to be remembered, and she likely never expected to be. But the woman who once dined with emperors and wrote letters to Tsarinas, who watched 2 of her children die by inheritance, who outlived palaces, dynasties, and belief itself, continued to wake each day in her old chair by the sea, her hands folded in silence, her gaze fixed on nothing visible. Because everything she loved had already left the room. She died the way she lived, quietly, without announcement, without parade, without legacy speeches or dramatic newspaper columns, without the velvet drapes drawn over a city in mourning, and without the rattling procession of titles and triumphs read aloud before a crowd who already knew how it would end. Princess Irene of Hesse and by Rhine simply stopped breathing in the spring of 1953. At the age of 87, in her modest, sea-facing home in Hemmelmark. And with her passing came not a rupture in history, but a ripple. A soft, easily missed tremor at the edge of memory. No state funeral was declared. No flags were lowered in foreign capitals. No royal train bore her body across a mourning nation. She was not a queen, not an empress, not even a consort of anyone still remembered by the world with sharpness. And so her death became what her life had long since turned into. A whisper beneath the roar of a century that had witnessed atomic bombs, genocide, moon landings, and televised coronations. The obituaries that appeared, those few paragraphs in German papers, tucked between reports of Cold War negotiations and football scores, were respectful, restrained, almost apologetic, as though even the journalists who wrote them weren't entirely sure what they were supposed to say about a woman whose story had unfolded mostly behind closed doors, whose titles had outlived their meaning, and whose grief had never been put into words, only felt by those few who had stood close enough to understand what she had lost. One obituary called her an unremarkable royal, a phrase so carelessly cruel it almost echoed with truth, not because Irene was unworthy of remembrance, but because the world had long since forgotten how to remember people who did not insist on being seen. She had never written memoirs, never dictated a biography, never offered herself as a source to historians. She left behind no scandal to excavate, no treasure trove of letters to reprint, no diaries in which she poured out her soul to be analyzed by academics desperate to reframe the past with 20/20 hindsight. Instead, she left behind rooms still arranged as though Waldemar might walk in again, hallways lined with portraits whose subjects were already buried, and shelves stacked with letters from a time when handwriting was still intimate, still sacred, still slow enough to matter. There was no dramatic deathbed scene, no moment of confession, no final monologue uttered to a priest or a nurse or a weeping family member at her side. Most likely she died in the early hours of the morning, perhaps with the soft creak of wind moving through the window latch, perhaps with the distant sound of seagulls circling the coast, perhaps alone, or perhaps with a servant she barely spoke to gently closing her eyes after the stillness set in. There was no monument built in her name, no school or hospital renamed to honor her quiet life, no televised tribute reminding the world that once, long ago, this woman had shared blood with czars and queens, with emperors and princes, with men who ruled continents and women who birthed empires. But the silence that followed her death was not emptiness. It was weight. It was echo. It was the sound of grief settling into the earth without resistance. Because for nearly 9 decades, Irene had borne the unbearable. Not just the loss of children, not just the watching of blood slowly leaving bodies she once carried inside her own, but the knowledge that it had all begun inside her, that the tragedy had not fallen from the sky, but had been written into her bones before she ever learned to speak. She had lived through 2 world wars, seen cities erased and rebuilt, seen cousins executed and crowns shattered, seen entire nations devour themselves in search of purity and power. And through it all, she had remained, a woman once destined for nothing more than polite marriage and imperial duty, now transfigured by sorrow into a kind of living tomb, carrying within her not just memory, but the echo of consequences that began with love and ended with coffins. Her death did not undo what had been done. It did not reverse the bleeding. It did not unbury the boys. But it did close a chapter that had remained unfinished far too long, a chapter in which no one screamed, no one blamed, and yet everyone paid. Her only surviving son, Sigismund, attended the burial with quiet restraint, his grief shaped not by surprise or violence, but by inevitability. The kind of mourning that arrives not like a storm, but like dusk, slowly, gently, and without the need for language. And when they lowered her into the earth, there were no speeches, only the sound of wind folding over the trees and the soft shift of soil against wood. No trumpets, no cannon, no final salute, just stillness. And maybe that, more than anything, was fitting. Because Irene of Hesse and by Rhine had never demanded history look her in the eye. She had never shouted her sorrow into the halls of Parliament or the pages of memoir. She had never asked the world to listen. And yet, for anyone who does, who stops, who looks back, who reads between the silences, what they find is not absence but weight, not insignificance but endurance, not erasure but testimony. Because not every legacy is loud. Some are built in silence, some bleed invisibly, and some, like Irene's, are carved not into stone, but into the fragile, flinching memory of bloodlines too proud to admit they were broken from the beginning. We forgot her because she was quiet, because she never ruled a country, never led an army, never passed a law, never defied a regime, never authored a doctrine, never posed in front of tanks, or held court from exile, or died for a flag. We forgot her because she didn't explode. She eroded. Because her life was not a drama of public downfall, but a slow collapse lived out in the privacy of hallways, behind heavy curtains, where sorrow sits on the furniture like dust that refuses to be dusted off. Because she never asked to be remembered, and history, ever hungry for spectacle, only records those who scream or burn. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't assassinated. She wasn't betrayed by her people or hoisted onto anyone's shoulders in defiance of tyranny. She didn't inspire revolutions or resist them. She didn't win anything. She didn't lose anything that history found worthy of headline print. What she endured in silence. And that, perhaps more than anything, made her invisible. History has a cruel hierarchy of grief. It honors the explosive, the political, the tragic when televised, but overlooks the pain that lives quietly, the kind that folds its hands in its lap and watches from a corner, saying nothing while the world moves past. She was, after all, just a princess. Not even a central one, not a ruling one. She never sat on a throne, never led a household with power. She didn't rebel against tradition. She was tradition. A woman raised to be poised, polite, undemanding. A woman trained to endure rather than express, to bend rather than break, to remain composed even as her world sank into slow, irreversible decay. And she did endure for nearly a century. Through palace funerals and war bunkers, through the roar of collapsing empires and the sharp silence of personal loss, through revolutions that shredded the fabric of European aristocracy, and through the dull ache of afternoons where time stood still in the scent of old paper and closed shutters. She endured not with fire but with numbness, not with fury but with ritual. And when she finally disappeared, When her voice, never loud, went silent forever, it was as though nothing had been lost at all. Not because it wasn't, but because we had already stopped seeing her decades earlier. And yet, when we look closely, when we set aside our love of spectacle, when we dig beneath the gold leaf names and battlefield legends and the portraits that hang in museums, we find that Irene's life was not a footnote. It was a warning. A lesson in how power, even when clothed in lace and manners, can be a carrier of ruin. She wasn't born to rebel against her lineage. She was born to continue it. To marry well, to bear children, to secure alliances, to keep the line pure. And in doing so, she passed on something far more lethal than any secret or betrayal. She passed on a broken strand of DNA, a gene twisted just enough to turn love into a death sentence. She didn't wield it knowingly, but she carried it invisibly. Like so many royal women of her time, women whose bodies were reduced to vessels of succession, whose wombs were kingdoms in miniature, and whose silence was mistaken for grace when it was really guilt made polite. Hemophilia wasn't her fault, but it became her responsibility. And as each son died, she understood more and more clearly that her life, measured in protocol and deference and composure, had become a long, slow witness to something she could never undo. A tragedy she didn't cause but couldn't prevent. A chain that wrapped around her wrists with every birth and tightened with every burial. And so, she faded. Not because the world forced her into darkness, but because she believed she no longer deserved to stand in the light. And the world, being what it is, let her go. It didn't need her anymore. She wasn't useful to the narratives being written. The ones about strong rulers, tragic heroes, fallen monarchs whose names would echo in classrooms and biographies. Irene had no power to lose, no throne to die for, no scandal to survive. She just lived. And it turns out that living, when done quietly and full of grief, is not enough to be remembered. But maybe it should be. Because what is more human than carrying pain you didn't choose? What is more noble than staying alive when you have every reason to collapse? She never found justice, but she also never demanded it. She never looked for redemption because she didn't believe she was entitled to it. She simply existed, in the shadow of greater names, under the weight of smaller tragedies. And in doing so, she became something larger than history knew how to honor. She became a question. What does it mean to be guilty by biology? What does it mean to pass on death in the act of giving life? What does it mean to bury children who died not because of violence or accident, but because of inheritance? And what does it mean when that inheritance begins not with sin or shame, but with a queen's blood passed through generations like a royal gift? We don't talk about these women. The ones who carried the curses, but not the crowns. The ones who loved in silence and lost in silence and died with names no longer written in school books. But maybe we should. Because Irene of Hesse and by Rhine was not an empress. She was not infamous. She was not loud. But she was there. At the edge of the 20th century's great roar, sitting in her chair by the sea, with hands that had cradled boys doomed by blood, and eyes that had seen empires fall, not in revolution, but in hospital beds. She did not make history. She endured it. And in the end, that might be the most painful role of all. She bled without a wound. She carried death without dying from it. And, as the 20th century marched onward, full of machinery and headlines and men who shouted from balconies, She sat quietly by the sea, in a house too large for one woman, with corridors too long for feet that no longer walked with urgency, and memories too sharp for a body that had grown dull with time. Princess Irene of Hesse and by Rhine had been born into a century that adored lineage, that praised noble blood as if it were sacred water flowing through chosen veins, as if to be royal was to be closer to heaven, safer from the common illnesses of ordinary men. But in the most cruel twist of nature, it was that very blood, praised and paraded and photographed in ceremonial robes, that brought her nothing but heartbreak. She was not poisoned by rivals. She was not exiled by revolution. She did not go mad, did not vanish in scandal, did not command armies or plot rebellions. She simply bore sons, 3 of them, and 2 of them died not by war or sin or negligence, but because her blood had betrayed them long before their bodies ever had a chance to grow strong. Heinrich died first, a boy who stumbled one day and never stood again, his tiny body drained from the inside, while doctors helplessly circled, and his mother, already pale with foreboding, sat beside him, unable to stop what had started in her womb years before. Waldemar died decades later, in a Germany that no longer knew where its loyalties lay, denied care by a collapsing world as his mother, old and exhausted, watched it happen again, watched the blood, invisible but fatal, win once more. And the third, Sigismund, survived, yes, but lived in a house where ghosts gathered quietly at breakfast, where grief shaped the air and where his mother, though present, had already begun her slow descent into silence. Irene did not fight back. She did not scream at the heavens or publish her sorrow. She folded it, pressed it, tucked it behind her spine and learned to breathe around it. And in doing so, she became something far more human and far more tragic than any history book could ever properly account for, because she became a mother who loved too deeply to speak of what she had done. Not deliberately, not maliciously, not even knowingly, but still, done, passed on. That single gene, threaded from Queen Victoria's body to her daughters, from womb to womb, across empires, was no longer just a mutation of science. It was a story, a chain of deaths, a ripple that began in palaces and ended in children's graves. And Irene bore that knowledge for longer than anyone else. She outlived the boys, the empires, the world that once celebrated her beauty and quiet grace. She outlived even memory, because by the time she died, few still remembered what her name had once meant. And yet, in that fading, in that absence, she revealed something that no royal spectacle ever could. That not all tragedies are loud. That not all suffering wears a crown of thorns or goes to the guillotine. Some tragedies come dressed in silk. Some sit quietly at the back of the room. Some live on long after the public has stopped clapping, stopped listening, stopped noticing. Because Irene didn't disappear with the fall of her dynasty. She stayed. She lingered. She endured. And in doing so, she became not a heroine, not a villain, not a myth, but something harder to name. A human being. One who was born into glory and buried in guilt. One who loved and watched that love unravel in hospital beds and telegrams and hollow chairs. One who lived in a time when women were taught to smile and never speak of blood, even as they bled inside. And so we end with her not because she was grand, but because she was forgotten. Because somewhere in the silence of history, there are always those who didn't scream, but suffered more deeply than we'll ever understand. Princess Irene of Hesse and by Rhine didn't die on a battlefield. She didn't die a martyr or a monster. She didn't even die tragically. She lived for 87 years. And that, perhaps, was the tragedy. To live with the knowledge that your greatest inheritance was death. To know that the thing passed from your body into your sons was not legacy, not love, not triumph, but an invisible wound. And to carry that weight across a century that never asked you to explain. She was a woman who watched her children bleed because of her blood. She was a princess who faded instead of falling. She was the echo of a crown that cost too much to wear. And she was, perhaps most painfully, one of the few who bled, without ever shedding a drop. Princess Irene didn't choose her blood. She didn't choose to be royal or to be a carrier of death. But what she did choose, quietly, painfully, was to live with it, to endure the unspoken, to bury her children, to fade instead of scream. In an age that worships drama, we often forget the quiet survivors. But Irene reminds us, some tragedies don't roar, they whisper, and still, they break us just the same.